Some are grateful in hindsight that the trial came. Such fire testing seasons are severe gifts from a loving Father, though initially they are rarely received as such. These seasons are necessary because we do not walk easily into maturity. At first, Christianity can be an intoxicating blend of freedom, joy, exuberance, and newfound discovery. Long-time sins drop off us with relatively little effort. Bible study is rich. We may feel like archaeologists finally coming across an unexplored cave as we become astonished at the insights that pour from the book in front of us. Intimacy, tears, and the assurance of God's voice and guidance mark our times of prayer. This spiritual infatuation phase is well known and well documented among spiritual directors and those familiar with spiritual formation. Just like romantic infatuation is self-centered, so spiritual infatuation tends to be all about me. It seems as though it's all about God, but the focus of new believers' lives is still mostly taken up with how they're doing with regard to defeating sins as well as cultivating the new joy and spiritual depth that come from walking with God. They're thrilled with what Christianity has done for them. Eventually, God asks us to discard this infatuation and move on to a mature friendship with Him. In a true friendship, it's no longer all about me. It's about partnering with God to build His kingdom. That means first, being fire-tested, and second, growing in ways that we naturally wouldn't be inclined to grow. This growth can be painful for us, but it's a growth that is necessary if we're to become the type of women and men whom God can use. Instead of focusing on our desire for God to answer our prayers, spiritual maturity leads us to yearn for faithfulness, Christ-likeness, and other-centeredness. This is a painful process, a very real spiritual death that some have described as being born again, except for the fact that it is never a one-time event. It is a mistake to ask someone to grow out of spiritual infatuation too quickly. Such a season has its place. There's no getting around the fact that babies need diapers and milk. But when a 10, 20, or 30-year-old still wears diapers and still acts as though the world revolves around his or her own personal happiness, something has gone wrong. The first sign that a believer has failed to move in a timely fashion past the spiritual infatuation stage is usually disillusionment. Whereas before they thought of God as only kind, only merciful, and only loving, they now tend to view Him as stubborn, severe, and unyielding. A wise spiritual director will seek to lay the groundwork for a new way of thinking during this stage. There's a place for this disillusionment, provided it affects the sea change that leads to mature friendship with God. If disillusionment remains, however, it ceases to motivate and eventually may bury the believer under its despair. The second mark is an ongoing, what's in it for me personally attitude. We live in a me-first culture, and we often try to individualize corporate promises, largely because we're more concerned about what the Bible says to us individually than about how it calls us to live in community, that is, as those who are a part of the church. Peter tells us that corporately we are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. Why? Not for any individual purpose, but for a corporate one that honors God, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10. When God calls us to Himself, He calls us to His church, to a purpose bigger than ourselves. This may sound shocking to some, but biblically, living for God means living for His church. There is a glory in the presence of Jesus Christ, seen when believers come together, that will necessarily be missing in an individual pursuit of God. When the gospel is turned from a community-centered faith to an individual-centered faith, Jesus would have died for me if I'd been the only one, we eclipse much of its power and meaning. The new groundwork that needs to be laid is an authentic faith that is based on a God-centered life. Rather than the believer being the sun around whom God, the church, and the world revolve in order to create a happy, easy, and prosperous life, God becomes the sun around which the believer revolves, a believer who is willing to suffer, even to be persecuted, and lay down his or her life.